Grandfather Arcelo once said that Manglano was correct. Grandfather had known Juan for a long time. He was said to be kind and was even able to keep up with the load back then. But when the dark wisdom came into play, his ability to dominate was employed. It was also his relatives from Dalaget and Kijur, who were sorcerers, that incited Juan. Perhaps this is what gave Juan's child the nerve to seduce. It is possible that the child also possessed some wisdom, which is why he was so confident and fearless in his seductions back then. In spite of everything, it could no longer be enjoyed. He was dead, and there was nothing Juan could do. When you think about it, it is extremely astonishing. Just imagine. Let's just say that he was killed by Grandfather, but using a Sigben. Who would be blamed, right? As long as it remains a secret, there really is nothing, except for those who know Grandfather. Manglano was left at the house with Miss Lorna and another albulario, and they left then. The reason Manglano was there was that he was carrying out a healing ritual. This is where he was to perform it, as the patient would arrive later that night. I asked Manglano why the treatment was to be done there, but Grandfather replied that the patient had been cursed and that the culprit might be a relative of Juan, so that everyone would be of one mind. It was better to treat the patient there, and Grandfather was the one who suggested it. You know, he speaks so eloquently that even his fellow albularios agree with him. I know that Grandfather Arcelo is truly the strongest among them. According to him, later that night, Nanay Cora was the first they spoke to. Someone had called for Grandfather, saying that someone needed healing. Grandfather said that they were merely trying to lure him into the house. There were two women. One, I think, was in her 20s, and the other was somewhat older. I believe they were mother and daughter. Grandfather was there talking to Manglano, while the mother and daughter were just sitting in the living room area. I was confused because I couldn't see that they were in any distress. They merely seemed anxious and worried, though it was evident they weren't sick. Then I heard Manglano say that the young lady had not had a proper sleep for a month because she was always having nightmares, walking around with her eyes closed. Fortunately, her family quickly took pity on her, as this happened well past midnight. It is said that the woman was cursed, a type of curse involving manipulation. I already said that the culprit belonged to Juan's side. No one else is fond of manipulation except Juan, whom I used to visit often. I wonder which of his relatives is responsible. If I'm not mistaken, this was the curse used by Juan's child on the victimized woman. Look at that young lady. She is attractive, and it wouldn't be surprising if she were widely admired. I felt like I was crazy back then, knowing nothing. I listened to them, but I didn't understand anything. So that is what a curse is, a form of manipulation. I asked how one gets cursed. According to Manglano, it is supposedly done by using alum, which I couldn't fully understand because I had no knowledge of it. According to Grandfather Arcelo, I should just let it be and eventually learn how this process works. He even told Manglano to show me how the alum procedure is carried out, as Grandfather wanted to be sure that the woman was indeed being cursed. In short, Grandfather Arcelo had Manglano repeat the procedure to see if everything matched the person he suspected. Manglano then proceeded and ordered me to fetch 2 matchsticks and a container of water. I nodded and quickly got the matchsticks. There was a jar at the top of the house with water in it, so I didn't have to go down. When I handed them over to Manglano, he called the young woman and had her sit by the floor, then placed the container with water in front of her. Manglano handed the 2 matchsticks to the woman, and she held them for about 10 minutes before returning them to Manglano. I felt like I was going crazy. My mind was in complete disarray, and I didn't know what was happening. Manglano blew on the two matchsticks while holding them in his hand, and after a few moments, he borrowed Grandfather Arcelo's tostos. I was puzzled because Grandfather, at that moment, pressed the two matchsticks against his chest, and when they caught fire, he immediately put them into the container with water. Grandfather seemed surprised, quickly sat down, and carefully stared at the two matchsticks. After a few moments, he pushed the two matchsticks with his index finger. They remained together, arranged in an X formation. But no matter how much Grandfather pushed, they did not separate. He even shook the container, but they still did not come apart.
Wow, that's some strength. The curse is powerful. I think a man was behind this.
Grandfather Arcelo said.
And that was exactly what I suspected, Arcelo. I have performed the process of Pagtatawahas countless times, yet that is still what appears. A matchstick was completely burnt. There it was, the victim. And on top of it lay the culprit, a man. Since he wasn't even burnt, it seemed as if he hadn't been ignited at all.
That was what Manglando replied back then. So that's what Pagtatawas really is. I used to think it literally meant tawas, which is why I eagerly awaited the elder to produce some tawas. Impressive, though I wasn't entirely sure. But two people had already confirmed it. With that simple thing, one could immediately understand a situation. Perhaps they had been studying that method for a very long time, but it's hard to imagine that such results could come from just those little sticks. I learned that there were many kinds of Pagtatawas back then, yet the one I witnessed with Manglando was one of the simplest. Nowadays, some use a candle dipped in water, with results taking forever, while others light one and suddenly pour water on it, causing an explosion of smoke mixed with ash. That is what an expert interprets. This method of Pagtatawas is extremely unpredictable because it happens so fast, and sometimes a patient is even subjected to smoke. If someone becomes irritated, it means it's due to the elements or perhaps witchcraft. But who wouldn't get irritated when the smell is so potent, extracted and mixed with bamboo? Let's return to the story. Grandpa went down from the house, and I saw him enter, near the porch. I peeked from the veranda and noticed him peering out from two openings. I immediately knew what was running through his mind. He was about to command the Sigben to find out who the witch was, and these were the Sigben. I grinned then, knowing that in just a few moments, Grandpa would take action, and I wasn't wrong. Something emerged from the opening and suddenly ran like a rat. Grandpa followed, and I quickly went down and silently trailed him as well.
Hey, where are you going? Go home. You have class tomorrow,
I exclaimed, though it seemed Grandpa didn't know it was vacation time. After all, he was the one who had gone to school alone. He simply shrugged, turned around, and motioned for me with a bamboo stick, saying we must hurry because his creatures were heading straight. We passed through the usual route toward the road, but the seawater was high, and almost half of my body got soaked. Since the Sigben roamed everywhere, we ended up taking the same path. There were puddles along the way, and I wondered why we kept stepping in them. Perhaps Grandpa was just teasing me, I thought, since I was rather short while he was tall enough that the water only reached above his knees. What about me, right? I expected that our house would be just like theirs, and that's how far we had to go. We eventually reached the road, but we didn't cross. Instead, we went straight and traversed the street. It was so far that the Sigben were seen passing by the mangroves. I spotted Grandpa's pets, one even near a lighted post. In the area we passed, there were no houses. Silence reigned, broken only by the sounds of animals and the clattering of things in the mangroves. That was all I could hear. Grandpa quickened his pace, and I could barely keep up. His face grew extremely serious, and soon he stopped talking to me. Perhaps it had been about an hour already. I was sweating and so exhausted. that it felt as if the skin in my groin had been peeled off. I was limping along, yet I couldn't complain because I had chosen to come along rather than being invited by Grandpa. He would have hit me if I complained. We finally reached the other side, near the neighboring village, and then continued walking toward the fields. The pain in my groin was unbearable, as if an iron and sand were being pressed against it. "Grandpa, when will we arrive?" I asked. He replied that it depended on when his pets would stop or take a break. "What if that's in another town, Grandpa? There's nothing we can do." Then he teased.
Wait, why are you complaining? You're so persistent to have come along.
I said no more after that, as the place was extremely hot. I was just tailing Grandpa. The problem was that it was extremely dark, and all I could see of him was his white clothing. I nearly tripped, and he only made the pain in my groin worse. Moments later, I heard the sounds of the Sigben, almost as if cats were fighting, and at that moment, I didn't know which direction they were coming from, for the noise was coming from all around. In that place, there was a little light, probably emanating from houses up ahead, since all I could make out back then was a faint glow.
Jun, just stay here for a moment. We're here now.
Ah, thank you.
We've finally arrived.
My wounds hurt, Grandpa. It's been such a long journey.
You keep wearing your underpants over and over, even without washing them. You're so stingy with your clothes. That's what you get. So, where are you going?
I'll sit down. You said you'd just stay here. Teach your Sigben to speak, Grandpa. Look how far they've gotten. It even seems like there's still sand on my bottom. Ah, I exclaimed. I sat by the side of a tree, feeling as though I were about to cry. Grandpa didn't speak, though it was obvious he was holding back laughter. He left, and that's when I saw the Sigben. They were simply perched atop the trees. Suddenly, they leaped up and followed him, which explained why the sound was coming from another direction. I stopped paying attention to it, as the pain in my groin became excruciating. I watched as Grandpa raised one of his hands, and then his Sigben scattered, followed by a whistle. I can't describe what happened next because I didn't really see it. All I know is that it was about an hour before he returned, late afternoon after a long run. He even sat beside me and talked at length, while I kept asking, "What now? Are we going home, Grandpa? Please say something. Don't lean on me too much. I'm struggling here." Grandpa sighed, stood up, and propped one hand against the tree I was leaning on. He bowed his head, and I couldn't keep up. He was impressive. It was as if he had prepared for my arrival, almost knowing what had happened to Juan. It truly wouldn't be possible otherwise, considering he also has a ward. "What is it that he have?" I asked. "Another Sigben?"
Not a Sigben. An Aswang, my dear. As I caught him still drinking, I couldn't keep up. Nothing I carried seemed to work. Even my Sigben couldn't get close.
Why do you look so exhausted, Grandpa? Aren't you the one who chases after things from all directions? Come on, I complained.
You just ask questions. It's all pointless.
Then I simply stood up and followed him. I really don't know what happened next. I was frightened when the word Aswang was mentioned. If we were indeed chasing, then Grandpa must have gotten quite far before he quickly changed direction. Perhaps he didn't want me to be tagged. That was all I could think at the time. Back then, he walked so fast, but now he kept stopping, as if he were utterly spent. Still, it was all right. At least he managed to rest, and especially me, because in those sandals, I didn't even feel my fatigue. My attention was completely consumed by the stabbing pain in my armpit. I was already moving to another place, perhaps because of his warning that something was chasing us, but Grandpa remained calm. I couldn't see the Sigben anymore, nor did I hear even their faint murmurs or bustling clamor. I assumed they had already gone home. We passed by the shore and through the mangroves. It was dangerous here, and we were extremely exposed. I asked Grandpa what he was afraid of and why he said it was dangerous. I was taken aback by what he had told me earlier. He claimed that 2 Aswang were following us. One of his Sigben was already dead, killed by an Aswang, and if it weren't for that Sigben's help, Grandpa too would have been dead. Without any hesitation, I immediately set off, even reaching the shore before Grandpa did, all the while glancing over my shoulder from behind, in front, and to the sides. Just as Grandpa had said, 2 creatures were following us. Even though I was irritated by the cuts and bruises, I no longer cared. Soon, my pace and the pounding of my heart returned to normal. Grandpa complained that I was moving so fast, as if I were running. A few minutes later, I heard the sound of the Sigben again. It was behind us, accompanied by a strange noise like the shrill bark of an angry dog.
Hurry up, go ahead.
Someone urged. What is that, Grandpa? It seems different.
Hurry, grandson. Those remaining Aswang will catch up soon. My trained animals were trying to hold them off. Hurry, run!
He shouted, and I immediately sprinted. When I reached the mangroves, I paid no mind to the sharp roots, even as the seawater rose up to my chest, some parts shallow, others deep, and the pain in my armpit worsened from the salty water. I churned up the water and the ground, and I didn't see Grandpa following me. Then I heard something coming from above the mangroves. I thought it was the Sigben, but when I looked, they were enormous, like humans, with even the smallest stems unyielding and seeming very light. I saw 2, and I strongly suspected they were Aswang. I dove into the water and fought my way through like a frog until I reached the river. This part was very deep, with a corner that seemed to pull me toward the sea. I crawled laboriously until I managed to cross, quickly climbed out of the shallows, and then dashed. My underwear was in disarray, the buttons had come off, and if you were to describe how I looked then, I must have appeared like a madman. I pressed on through the low vegetation without a care, even as I felt pain on my face, arms, and chest. It was evident I was wounded, yet I felt no fatigue, as if I weren't even breathing. That's what happens when you're extremely nervous. Eventually, I reached a sandy shoreline with ample space and a clear path, though I sensed the Aswang were still following me. I no longer knew what had become of Grandpa. Unexpectedly, I tripped on a coconut husk and tumbled, my toes feeling as if they were about to break. When I stood up, I could feel the numbness. After a few moments, something burst in front of me, causing me to stop and furrow my brows as I examined it. There was a faint light, because there was a house ahead, and I saw a shadow, a human shadow, though I couldn't make out its features. Because the light was working against me, I quickened my pace, and that's when I felt overwhelming exhaustion. As I walked, I had no idea what was happening, and I couldn't take my eyes off that person. I eventually caught up, and we were almost a hand's span apart. His face was hideous, and without a second thought I ran. If I'm not mistaken, that was the Aswang, and it was the one chasing me. However, it was alone, while earlier I saw 2 atop the mangroves. That creature chased me, because when I looked behind, it was following. It didn't run like a human. Instead, it moved like an animal, its hands skimming along the sand. Then something caught my eye. A creature appeared by the coconut grove that looked like a cat, moving incredibly fast. When I glanced back, the Aswang was rolling in the sand, leaping and splashing water everywhere. When I finally reached the house, I stopped but didn't ask for help. I observed the creature as it struggled with another being that was only as big as a cat. It became clear to me what it was. It was none other than Grandpa's Sigben. Moments later, I heard the voice of Grandpa Arcello. He was already ahead of me, just a short distance away, as if he had gotten there first. I was puzzled, but I didn't pay it any further attention.
What are you doing? Come on.
Without another word, I ran again, until I noticed that the place we had reached was familiar to me. It was within our village. I breathed a sigh of relief, as if I wanted to lie down on the ground, drained of all the endless energy from running. Suddenly, I grew tired, as if I were about to faint. Grandpa was gasping for breath and coughing violently, as if he were dying. Fortunately, we arrived. I didn't turn toward our house. Instead, I went straight to Grandpa's home, where Manglano was already waiting. He was alone now, and the patient was no longer there. He greeted us, as if he didn't realize how utterly exhausted we were. According to Grandpa, he had been ambushed, and his companion had died at that time. It was a blessing that we made it home.
What? Did you go in immediately? You should have told me so we could have been prepared. You should have just left since it happened suddenly. Wait, maybe he was alone, right?
Manglano replied.
No, he wasn't alone. He got Aswang companions. I didn't even realize that I had dropped what I was carrying. Until we got home, I hadn't encountered any opponents. Fortunately, there was a Sigben. Those creatures really do come out, and I'll hunt them down even in broad daylight. I didn't even realize that I had dropped what I was carrying. Until we got home, I hadn't encountered any opponents. Fortunately, there was Aswangs. Those creatures really do come out, and I'll hunt them down even in broad daylight.
As Grandpa said angrily. I was like a drenched rag lying on the porch, unable to make it inside. I collapsed, utterly drained. According to Grandpa, no matter what he had instructed Manglano to do, nothing could have helped, as their power was limited, and they were unaware of the situation in that area.
What's your plan, Alcelo?
I'll take care of those two Aswang first, the one that delayed me so much. I lost one companion. I already know where he lives. Hey, Junjun, get up and move inside.
I moved into the house, but I didn't go into any room. I just went to the living room, to the long bamboo bench. I didn't have time to wash up. Even the blood on my body had vanished. I only felt Manglano massaging me and applying something to my arm, treating my wounds. As for Grandpa, I didn't know where he was. When I asked Manglano, he said that Grandpa was regaining his strength. He had only seen him like that once before. Perhaps the opposing witch doctor was very powerful. The patient was uncertain if he could be healed and could only hope in Grandpa. I fell asleep. When I woke up in the morning, the sun was high, my eyes stung, and my body ached terribly, as if I had been beaten the previous night. I could barely stand. I saw Manglano and Lolo Arcelo on the porch. They were talking, and I could hear what they were discussing, still about that enemy. I tried to stand up, but my toes were wrapped in cloth with crushed leaves caught in them. I could smell the oil mixed with various kinds of roots on my body, and I was beginning to taste sour from not having washed. Even though my body ached, by the grace of the Lord, I could still walk. I sat down beside them on the porch, where Nane Cora was also present, seated on the steps. Then my father arrived carrying puto, which he handed to me along with some milk. He asked if I was all right, and I nodded. I expected anger, yet I saw none in my parents. It was as if they believed I was fine.
Cora, Greg, don't go off arguing among yourselves. Stay in the house for now and wait for my signal. Stay here and be alert,
They instructed. My parents exchanged glances and nodded, adding that it would be better for us all to stay together in one house. So, they remained at Grandpa's house for the time being. That was for the best, for I still wasn't fully recovered. I had lost so much strength.
Cora. Please put some charcoal on the 2 protective charms. It was meant for guarding, to empower them, and because that charcoal serves as medicine for my Sigbins.
Your familiars are there, right?
Just put it on already. Greg, take that one net of yours, the thick one, and hang it across the entire porch for defense, in case something suddenly comes tonight.
Shortly afterward, my parents left, and I immediately asked Lolo why he wasn't leaving too, for I remembered what he had said last night. He mentioned that even in daylight, he would chase the Aswang, but according to him, he decided against it because he knew in his heart that those who would come to the house were coming of their own accord. Then, Manglano took his leave, suggesting that we call another folk healer, Albulario. Ailing Lorna was to accompany him, for it turned out that one of the folk healers, named Benito, lived far away but would be visited by Manglano, and if others could help, he would bring them as well. It felt as if a war was about to break out. That was what I thought at that moment. The day seemed interminably long. I found myself watching the clock, and as night approached, Lolo sensed that something significant was likely to happen. They carried out Grandpa's orders. Our house was transformed into a kind of fortress, entirely wrapped in nets, with sticks wedged in to make them sturdier. Lolo moved the protective charms to the porch. I then peered outside, for one had already perished, and I was sure that only 3 remained facing me. I was startled to see 3 black cats, almost unnoticeable as they bathed. Lolo explained that when the Sigben are healing, they assume the form of animals, though they do not reveal their true appearance. That's what they really are. I thought that was all I had heard initially, but I had yet more to discover. Furthermore, I learned that the Sigben drank the foam from the sea, foam from the edge of the sea, which, as we can notice by the coast, is said to be rich in vitamins. And if they were in the fields or in the river, they would drink at the very end of the river, where it truly originates. It is usually at a spring, because the river's source is mystical, imbued with the energy of nature. Additionally, I learned that the Sigben do not literally cause harm. It depends on their master. Whatever the master commands, even if it means the Sigben must kill, they will do it. If you come across them in a place and notice that, it is most likely that the Sigben's owner is dead, because when the owner is still alive, the Sigben will not roam. They cannot be seen by others except by the owner's relatives. They have a familial permission, determined by the scent of that creature, and if anyone else sees them, it is the wise ones who do. Thus, when the Sigben wander about, they no longer have an owner. From what I learned from Lolo, if they do not transfer to a relative, they will look for another owner. The Sigben are said to have their own will. They choose the master who will care for them. I know someone who has a guardian Sigben from Negros, and when I asked him about the Sigben's behavior, he said the same thing as Lolo. And the Sigben belonging to my acquaintance were numerous. Apparently, a stray dog once wandered into their basement, and because he loved dogs, he took it in, cared for it, and fed it, until he was surprised when another one arrived. One day, when he was about to feed them, he saw rocks tied up instead. He quickly looked for it, but found nothing. However, that same night it returned, but upon inspection, the one that was tied up was no longer a dog. Instead, they were 2 terrifying creatures. He immediately took them to a folk healer, and it was then discovered that those were Sigben. He was told not to worry, because he was chosen to be their master. He was instructed to take care of them, not to use them for exploitation or mischief, and to let them roam freely so they could get used to it, just like a dog. But when they are tied up, they become extremely fierce. The Sigben do not break free, even though they are capable of doing so. They simply obey whatever their master intends. Perhaps you might wonder why I am so interested in these creatures. You will know later. Let's return to the story. The cats may look cute, but in reality, they are quite hideous. Until finally, when night came, I began to feel anxious, especially Lolo, who seemed restless. After a short while, Mang Lano arrived, accompanied by Aling Lorna and Mang Benito. They were fully equipped, each carrying their own items. Aling Lorna had various necklaces hanging around her neck and held a talisman and a rosary. Mang Lano carried a black wooden object, a tucked-away bolo, and wore a necklace, while Mang Benito looked like a hermit. There is also a bandana that is red mixed with yellow. It had a staff, but it was actually a tree root. It carried a small container, its equipment. They were talking, specifically about what to do when a commotion occurs. They each had their own approach, but according to Grandfather Arcelo, one should not act when a commotion occurs until he gives the signal. There was no defense in the area. He deliberately did that so that the Aswang would approach. His signal was, supposedly, after the Sigben had moved. The experienced ones reached an agreement. At that time, I saw that both mother and father appeared anxious, looking at me as if they were extremely scared. As the night grew darker, Mang Lano and Grandfather were already on the veranda, while Aling Lorna was sitting on the cot at the edge of the laid-out mat where mother and father were sleeping. The statue was laid on the floor. The Santo Niño had one hand severed. What I saw was only the hand holding a staff, but the other was gone. It was bent over, mumbling something, while Mang Benito was nearby, close to the bathroom, where there was space that offered a full view of the outside. Although I was sleepy, I endured, for no matter what happened, it was extremely dangerous. I was already prepared, probably ready for the pursuit, but in the end, I was the one being chased. My body still ached terribly, but Grandfather appeared remarkably vigorous. I didn't even see him rest or doze off even briefly. Last night's events were exhausting, yet from what I observed, it seemed as if nothing had happened. In fact, it looked extremely ferocious. Then came the rolling of its eyes, perhaps during the midnight hours. I grew tired, so I decided to shut my eyes to at least get some rest. But suddenly there was a ruckus in the basement. I immediately got up and looked out the window. I saw Grandfather and Mang Lano collaborating on someone. It was rather dark at the back of the house.
Release him, Benito. You savage animal. I clearly remember you made me run like crazy. You don't fight fair. Now you are the one who came forward, then you got caught. What? Are you shocked? If you're not an animal, you spoke with me, so what did you do? You chased me with your minions, beating me to it, but now I've beaten you. You have no excuse.
Turning to Mang Lano, he added,
Release those two already. Just command your minions. This is what's important for us now. After all, they wouldn't dare to attack, right?
It was Grandfather's suggestion. Since Mang Lano was still beating the two Aswang, he eventually released them and ordered them never to return.
Those creatures look pitiful. They are terrifying, but you're the one who's all beaten up, aren't you?
As I crawled to move, I heard them groaning continuously. What I don't understand is why they didn't just kill it. Instead, they let the two creatures go. Mother and father had been complaining back then that they should have been killed already, while Rubel, whose mouth was shattered and one eye seemed about to pop out, couldn't even speak. I can't fully describe what the initial incident was, because I was lying down at the time and didn't really see it clearly. Much like what Grandfather Arcelo did to Juan, he did the same to Rubel, though it wasn't as severe. Only part of his body was paralyzed. I heard he would shatter his hold and his burden, ensuring he could never return to being a witch. After that, with a pat and a slight smack, Rubel's body trembled. Grandfather then suggested taking Rubel to the roadside and letting him go home, if he were still able to make it, because when morning comes, surely people will celebrate his defeat. After that, the area fell quiet. Manglano immediately returned after delivering Rubal's body, while ailing Lorna hesitated, insisting that he should have been killed already. But grandfather said that the Aswang would eventually die on its own. Let it go home, so that, in some way, it may die there. They also said that the bite of the Sigben was extremely poisonous and had affected them, leaving none of them safe. And one more thing. Those creatures could no longer take human form. They were restrained by Lolo and Harang, so that their Aswang nature remained exposed. That's when I understood why they were set free. Lolo was right, and at least we wouldn't have been troubled back then. If they had died there, it would have only brought further hardship. No one would have reported it since they were in Aswang form. Lolo was wise in that regard. Everything was premeditated. From the preparations made at home, the elimination of the enemy, even the witch, was carried out properly. I don't even know if the enemy could have been properly eliminated if it had continued to live. I saw that it even bore a bite from the Sigben. Fortunately, everything turned out successfully. Manglano's patient recovered, for both the Kulam and the witch were shattered. Our lives became peaceful. Mother and father had returned to their own pursuits. As for me, I was just beginning to be taught by Lolo on how to command the Sigben. Besides that, Manglano was also instructing me in wisdom. I even asked, why not let Lolo do it? But Lolo replied that if he were to teach me, my body would be overwhelmed. So I deferred to Manglano, a decision my parents accepted, especially since they could tell by my very scent that I was supposedly the one chosen by Lolo, particularly because I was the one responsible for feeding the Sigben. Now, you know why I was so fascinated by the Sigben back then, for I am the one who now cares for them.